So what I want to talk about today, and links in directly with what Tim was saying, it's about going forward with our public health, nutrition and food policy agendas and the critical role of evidence and how we use evidence in informing the decisions towards making those policies. And, well, it's both how we use them and don't use evidence. I've organised a talk around these points, so after just a brief introduction about why it's important. The critical issue that we tend to skate over, I want to dig into a bit of this. It's what constitutes evidence for food and nutrition policy. And the premise is that there are contested views around what evidence is. It's about the relevance of the evidence, the quality of the evidence, and so forth, and how evidence is framed. Then, sort of the fun part, I want to talk about what's happening in practice and the departure from the theory, if you like, and how we might start reforming evidence use. You know, I don't want to get expectations out of whack here. This is sort of work in progress, and I think I'd be really interested in sort of maybe following up discussions with people about how we do start working through a reform process, because we desperately need it, and just make some concluding comments. So, why is evidence use in public health nutrition policy important? I'm going to interchange public health nutrition and food and nutrition policy, not least because it's easier to fit pH in on the slide than food and nutrition. So there we go. Dietary risk factors are now the leading contributors to the global burden of disease. 1.9 billion adults are overweight or obese. On the other side of the equation, 805 million people are undernourished or food insecure. And 162 million children under 5 years are stunted. So we talk about the three different forms of malnutrition, and there they are. And you can see they're substantial. And this data is just weeks old. This has just recently come out. Now that's critical, of course, but increasingly we're looking at not just the health agenda, we're looking at the sustainability agenda. And so keeping very much focused on the healthy and sustainable diets agenda and the bi-directional relationship that's in play here. So we're seeing the impact of the environment on nutrition status, public health nutrition status. And this line could be fleshed out to 100 pages, the impact of the environment on nutrition. But just focusing on some of the key issues. And I've sort of focused a lot on this in presentations because in the real world, what we constantly see with the resistance to sustainability coming into the nutrition agenda is, how does this relate to nutrition? And I'll show you a slide in a moment about our experiences with the Dietary Guidelines in Australia. And I just find that absurd to be even asking those sort of questions. The environment affects the yield that we produce. It affects the quality of the food we're producing. And I think this one, if we needed any sort of stark example, it affects the composition, the nutrient composition of our food. Increasingly, we're seeing evidence that the environment, climate change, for example, affects the micronutrient composition of crops. So we're talking about the iron composition, the zinc composition, but it also affects the macronutrient composition. So the ability to uptake nitrogen and so on in the soils, into food and what have you. So there's multiple reasons why the environment does engage directly and indirectly with nutrition. And then I mentioned this bidirectional relationship. So going back the other way, we have how food demand affects environment. Perhaps the clearest example of this is overconsumption. Obviously the clear relationship between obesity and stresses on the environment. Why, in a time of obesity, are we over-consuming, obviously, but also why are we choosing to consume so much discretionary foods, junk foods, just wasted energy, if you like. The issues around food waste, animal production versus plant-based diets and so on. And yet, this is a quote that's now over 70 years old from The Lancet. There's no field of practical importance related to human well-being in which there is a greater opportunity for dogmatism and quackery, pseudoscience and unwarranted presumptions and prescriptions than in the domain of the diet. And last time I was in the UK, this is about 2 years ago, I thought this was just a perfect example of this quote. It's not about nutrition, it's all about astrology. There you go, we've solved the obesity problem. So what's the conventional model for evidence use? I probably don't need to explain this in detail to people in the room. Just quickly, what we're talking about here is origins in evidence-based medicine, particularly from the 1970s onwards, and particularly led by Archie Cochrane. And so the work we now have with evidence-based nutrition and so on can trace its roots back to the evidence-based medicine movement. It morphed into evidence-based healthy policy when we're getting closer to nutrition, and then morphed again, well, among many people, into evidence-informed health policy, because surprise, surprise, policies aren't just based on evidence, they're based on a whole lot of political, social and so on influences. The Cochrane Collaboration's been set up, and so have a myriad of other institutions to look at the synthesis of evidence, and they pride themselves on their processes about being systematic and how they go about collecting the evidence, publishing the evidence, their transparency. They've got very well invested critical appraisal procedures, and most notably the levels of evidence concept, which we can see on that pyramid there. So at the top of the pyramid, so we rank the evidence against the quality of the methods that we used in terms of the ability to control for bias. So we've got the top of systematic reviews right down through to case studies and expert opinion. Okay, so that's been well developed, well resourced, well tried in that medical setting. The question we come to is, with these conventional approaches, how relevant are they to public health and nutrition? And that's now going to be the basis of what I want to talk about. First thing to say is the contested worldviews over what constitutes evidence for food and nutrition policy. Critically, evidence in public health and nutrition varies from the conventional approaches in two particular ways. How the causes of the public health and nutrition problems are framed, and this is a source of ongoing debate, and how the food and health relationship is conceptualised. So I'm going to come back to those 2 points to illustrate these different contested views. And I'm going to use it, I'm just going to spend 5 or 6 minutes just going through what I refer to as paradigms to capture these contested views around these two characteristics. These are broad-based paradigms, and I'm not pretending that they are, there are clear delineations between them. They do tend to overlap in their characteristics, but we're talking about the medical paradigm, the lifestyle paradigm, and the socio-ecological paradigm to capture these different ways of framing the use of evidence. So here's the medical paradigm. And it's where nutrition science started. And in fact, nutrition science gets a bit of glory in the evidence-based medicine movement because that's where the first clinical trial was conducted with Lind, who was the physician with the Royal Navy. And, it's quite infamous now. He identified scurvy, or didn't have to identify, he saw scurvy quite prevalent among the naval officers, among the seamen, among everyone, and he ran the trial. He didn't know what the critical factor was to treat and prevent scurvy. In other words, he didn't recognise vitamin C at the time, but he did recognise citrus juice as the solution at the time. It took over 100 years for the British Navy to put that policy into practice after getting the evidence, when the rations were changed to introduce citrus into the naval rations. So what are we talking about here? The framing in a medical context is that inadequate nutrient intake is causing nutrient deficiencies and abnormal physiological status in an individual. And the causal mechanism for doing our trials, collecting the evidence, is the simplest of the three paradigms. We're talking about a linear relationship. It's context-free, and it's simply, here's an example, vitamin A, retinol status, and ultimately impact on morbidity and mortality. In a policy application sense, this is the basis for dietary reference intakes, or what Codex, Australia and so on would refer to as the nutrient reference values. So does that make sense, that sort of medical paradigm way of thinking? It's been the dominant paradigm for nutrition science and the production of evidence since nutrition had its birth. But there are problems with the medical paradigm for nutrition relative to the drug trials and the clinical trials that the Cochranes and so on work with. Conceptually, the basis is totally different. We're talking about with drug interventions that are designed to treat a disease that is not produced by the absence With nutrition, it's of course the reverse. Nutrient interventions are designed to prevent the physiological dysfunction resulting from an inadequate intake. So conceptually, we're working on different underlying causes. Drug effects tend to vary with dose and in a linear way, but with many nutrients, we see this sigmoid curve on the response to nutrient exposures. So at very low levels of nutrient intake, particularly when we're in an inadequate state, a small change in nutrient intake will have a marked impact on our health. And then when we're in the sort of the healthy range of intake, we might double, triple, or whatever the exposure to the nutrient with no change in our physiological status until we then go into excess. And suddenly, again, a small level of change will have a big impact on our health. And drugs tend to operate in a relatively short period of time, whereas nutrients may take a far longer period to manifest. The second paradigm, which we started to see from the 1950s onwards, was around the epidemiology of the non-communicable diseases. So now the framing changes. We're not talking about nutrients anymore. We're now talking about foods, which is what people eat. We're talking about dietary patterns. And so we're talking not just about nutrient deficiencies, but we're talking about elevated risk factors to do with those non-communicable diseases. And the policy application is food-based dietary guidelines that we will now current for 65 or so years. The mechanism for collecting the evidence becomes a bit more complex. So we're talking about multifactorial and context-rich relationships. And those contexts are the very issues that are often stripped out in randomised controlled trials. They're the things that explain often the underlying basis to the evidence. So you can see that trying to use an RCT to analyse in this sort of paradigm becomes problematic. When conducting a well-designed RCT, we're stripping away often the very explanatory variables we're seeking to find. I've put this example up. It's from Barbara Burlingame, for those of you who know her, who used to be the nutrition director at FAO. And she makes the point, this is, I think, a really powerful slide. It's very topical. There's a big push to focusing on nutrient interventions, particularly in low and middle income countries. And an example of that is Codex has just put onto its agenda a work program around biofortification and the issue of increasing exposure to a nutrient like vitamin A. And they've used, Barbara refers to, here's our common variety banana on the right there, which we might have in London or Melbourne or wherever. And, typically it has 5 micrograms of carotenes in 100 grams. When she goes around these countries, low and middle income countries, the indigenous bananas have 8,500 micrograms of carotenes. I mean, suddenly this contextual issue becomes really important. And you start to question, why are we going through these high technology type interventions, these nutrients that are focused interventions, when if we start pulling back a bit and looking at the indigenous food supply, is it necessary? Is it just a redundant process? In fact, I think it's worth, and I'll come up with show you a reason in a moment. So there are now increasing challenges of trying to develop our evidence base around these dietary patterns and foods if we're relying on this conventional clinical trials approach. The challenges are, well, there's many, but here are the key 4. Accounting for food synergy dynamics. So food is more than just a collection of nutrients. There's synergies within those nutrients. The nutrients can affect each other's bioavailability. The food matrix itself will affect risk factor responses. There's a difference, for example, in cholesterol level impact whether you consume dairy as cheese versus whether you consume it as butter or so on. Randomisation and compliance becomes a major issue with foods and dietary patterns. Now that's central. Randomisation is central to a randomised control trial. The clue is in the name. How do you randomise diet? I mean, apart from anything else, you can see what people are eating. But then how do you comply with that randomisation for decades before you might see a chronic disease outcome? So we're struggling to try and match the design of randomised control trials with the underlying paradigm here. Thirdly, controlling for context. Well, I've already mentioned one context around the nature of the food supply. But there are so many contexts to take into account with food and dietary patterns. Just in the last couple of months, we've seen evidence emerging, I mean, things that I just wouldn't have thought of a year ago. The size of the plate on which people eat possibly influences the amount of food they consume. The time of day people eat might influence the metabolic response. So there are all these contexts around dietary patterns and foods and so on. And finally, the disease outcomes themselves. They're multifactorial mostly, non-communicable diseases. And they may take decades to emerge. So are we going to sit around for 20, 30 years with these highly controlled, randomised control trials waiting for some outcomes to provide our evidence? The final paradigm is around the socio-ecologic paradigm. And this has just been, I mean, I'm not trying to play favourites here, but I will. I mean, this is the paradigm which I see as essential if we are going to be effective in addressing the challenges we're confronted with now. I don't see how we can tackle healthy and sustainable diets with a nutrient approach. Yeah, it has to be in this context of food systems. And we've been given a huge boost through just a week or two ago, the Global Nutrition Report was released. And front and centre there, I'm presuming with the influence of people like Corinna Hawkes and so on, who was involved in its preparation, was this statement: growing evidence on the rise of obesity and these NCDs in the context of undernutrition makes it increasingly clear that it's food systems that are the drivers of nutrition outcomes. So if the food systems are driving it, they need to be the focus of solving it. So getting back to these two characteristics, how's the issue framed? Well, social and ecological determinant of food system integrity is causing biological, social and environmental impacts among populations. So you can see we're suddenly expanding the scope. We're going beyond just health. We're talking about relationships of their environmental impacts, their social determinants and so on. We're stepping out of this narrow framing which might have suited RCTs, but do these randomised controlled trials pick up these factors? And I would suggest that they struggle to, because we're talking about multifactorial, context-rich and non-linear relationships working through the food system. And I don't want to scare people off food systems, but here's an example of what, in fact a relatively simple example of what some food systems research might look like. It's very layered. And what we're talking, I mentioned non-linear relationships. So what we're seeing here, and this relates to the pricing of food, and so I apologise about the size of the words, but it's the structure that I want to sort of focus on here. We've got these non-linear relationships. So we've got feedback loops happening. We've got delays in one part of the system coming into effect while another aspect of the food system operates. We might have parts of the system which have a positive feedback and promote some aspect, whereas another might feed back in a negative way. So there's all these complex interrelationships. I don't want to scare people off, but I think this is a really exciting area for research and how we start digging into the program logic around systems thinking. And ultimately, food systems are the antithesis of a reductionist approach, the clinical trial approach to collecting evidence, because it's the dynamics of the whole system that's critical. You can't break the system down and say, we'll just focus on this relationship here, because it's meaningless, because that relationship there is shaped by the other relationships around it. It's similar to this issue of food synergy. You can't just focus on an individual nutrient in the food. It's the whole package. All right, some fun things to show you. What's happening now with evidence use? And putting on my sort of policy science hat for a moment and jumping to the conclusion, what I'd argue is that this simplistic notion that evidence feeds in a linear fashion into policy just isn't reality. And you know, there's five main models that the literature would tell us about evidence use in food policy making. And the two models that fit this in an idealised sense would be the knowledge-driven model and the problem-solving model. Of course they do happen from time to time, but I'm talking now in general. And this is the approach to policy science, which I think just holds up consistently when we look at our case studies. It's the political tactical model. So there is this constant to and froing between the evidence that's being pushed into the system and the policy pull. And if we just pause on this for a moment, we can see the vulnerability of both sides of this equation to external influence. Evidence doesn't speak for itself. You know, there's this, I think this is a really interesting contradiction with evidence. We make this assumption that it's rational, it's objective, and so on. But in practice, how it's framed, how the evidence is collected, how it's interpreted, and how it's applied is a social construct, and it's about how people come into interplay with that. So we've got, you know, two diametrically opposed processes happening here, and of course policy. Well, you know, I'm sure everyone in the room is fully familiar with the politics of policy making. So what counts as evidence? I'm going to look at the efficacy side of the equation. I'm going to look at the risk side of collecting evidence. Now, this was a little bit of a quick straw poll, so I only did this yesterday, so just a very quick, but this is, I think, not atypical of what's happening. If you go on the Cochrane Library site and you just put in the search public health and nutrition, 77 hits come up. So these are 77 systematic reviews that have been done around evidence around a nutrition topic. When you drill into it, and we look at those three paradigms, other dominates, and other was, I don't know why I even got into the search, but it might have been physical activity interventions or some very focused intervention for HIV/AIDS or something like that. So putting those aside, what we have is, in that medical paradigm, the nutrient-focused approach, we've got the vast majority of our systematic reviews coming out. So we're collecting lots of evidence about what works with nutrients in interventions, nutrient-based interventions. Far less in that lifestyle paradigm. So far less evidence is being produced for informing policies that might be around dietary pattern type interventions, and a couple less for the socio-ecological approach. So what's that show? I mean, as I said, it's just a sample of one, but you know, just observationally, if we look at the other databases around of systematic reviews, we see this massive skewing of the evidence that's available to inform policy. It's predominantly coming out in this nutrient-focused intervention approach. If that's the main evidence you've got to draw on, wouldn't you think that's going to influence what policymakers might think about how they might design their policies? Now, when we look at the individual systematic reviews, and we look at which critical appraisal approaches are being used for judging the quality of the evidence and the relevance of the evidence, we're seeing this domination of the randomised control trial approach. The difficulty with that is, when we get into a food-based intervention or a food systems-based intervention, it's having to, if you like, demonstrate its efficacy in a trial setting. And as I've suggested before, that's problematic. And the question I'd pose is, how much in public health nutrition should we be expected to keep performing against this conventional approach to collecting evidence? And we should start adapting and reforming the approach so it's fit for purpose. It's flexible and matches the nature of the issue we're attempting to address. So we stop trying to use clinical trials to produce evidence that food systems is an appropriate approach. And we start adapting evidence approaches that match the needs of a food systems thinking. Now, another issue about shaping the evidence that's available is which interventions are funded, evaluated, and then published. If we don't fund these interventions, if we don't evaluate them and we don't publish them, well, they're not there to then go into the systematic reviews in the first place. Here's an example of some work done in Vietnam. And what I'm showing here is, back in 2011, this paper came out from the National Institute of Nutrition, and they were very proudly talking about their food-based dietary guidelines. and their food systems approach to dealing with issues, malnutrition issues. And they mentioned food systems in their dietary guidelines. They review their guidelines every 5 years, and they've been doing so for 15 to 20 years. 1 year later, we see this paper come out, and suddenly we've gone from this dietary guidelines and trumpeting this work here, and it's all about using food fortification of the staples in Vietnam for solving these malnutrition problems. Now, a couple of points to say. One of my PhD students is from Vietnam, and she just ties herself in knots with anxiety about this. What we're seeing here is a classic example of a sort of a capacity differential. This sort of work just struggles to get implemented. We get the dietary guideline statements, but in terms of the interventions, we're now seeing this shift towards these micronutrient-based interventions. And then they're the ones that get evaluated. Now, I've got nothing inherently, see nothing inherently wrong with a micronutrient intervention in its place. But when it becomes the only intervention that we're implementing and evaluating, where it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that it's the only intervention for which we can get evidence to then form policy, and the cycle repeats itself. Also, again, I apologise about the size of the writing, but there's a very well-funded number of organisations and stakeholders shaping this, the way these interventions are being implemented. So you'll see that we've gone from the National Institute of Nutrition here these were the sole authors up here. Within 12 months, we've got groups like GAIN. If you know GAIN, they're a very powerful, well-funded group in low and middle income countries. They get a lot of Bill and Melinda Gates funding. And they work through these national institutes of nutrition in countries and so on. So you can see this, the way we are shifting the nature of the interventions and therefore the evidence available. And you can't talk about this without talking about conflict of interest. So I was struggling to try and keep the words down on this slide because there's just so many good examples I wanted to give you in here. So I sort of picked the top three, and they're very well. The first one, and this is often cited, probably the most well-cited one in the food area, that Lesson and colleagues showed that articles sponsored by food and drink companies are 4 to 8 times more likely to have conclusions favourable to the interests of those food and drink companies than those not sponsored by those companies. More recently, in the area of the sugar-sweetened beverages and the relationship with weight gain and obesity, this was a nice study because it was looking at the systematic reviews, not just individual articles, but the reviews of those articles. So they were 5 times more likely to present a conclusion that there was no positive association between sugar-sweetened beverage consumption and obesity relative to systematic reviews where there was no conflict of interest. And a week ago, this came out in the New York Times, which I thought was very interesting. The headline in the article is Coke discloses millions in grants. Over the last 5 years, Coke's put $120 million into sponsorship of health agencies and researchers doing work on obesity. That's just in this 5-year period. I find that, well, interesting, at least, about how these agencies, it's the dietetic organisations, it's researchers in the obesity area. Not just any old sort of researchers, but those targeted particularly at, surprise, surprise, the issues that are being levelled at Coke. I suppose the only positive I could find about this is at least they were being transparent. They made a commitment that they would show where they're spending their money. So this was, this came out immediately after it was put on their website where it's going. So that's all about producing evidence for efficacy. Let's have a look at the evidence for risk. And I'm going to focus particularly on the Codex Alimentarius Commission's approach to collecting evidence about the risk of interventions. And up until 2009, there wasn't a nutrition risk analysis approach at Codex, well, not a formalised one. The risk analysis framework was basically what you see in this circle without the word nutritional in front of it. So it was designed primarily for toxicology, microbiology and so on. And then Codex recognised, given all the nutrition work that they're doing around food regulation, that they need to extend their risk analysis approach to nutrition issues. And that was really encouraging at the time. What we find is how they've framed nutrition risk. And to cut to the end, the way they've framed nutrition risk is about toxicology and microbiology in a nutrition setting. So we have a lot of work done on issues of overexposure to a nutrient or insufficient exposure to a nutrient. That's important, but that relates straight back to that first paradigm I was talking about. So it's just about that nutrient risk. So good, but not sufficient. It doesn't, for example, protect against these sort of outcomes, which would fit to me in that sort of second paradigm, the dietary imbalance type concerns. So if Codex reforms its policies around fortification or health claims, for example, it would be very concerned about what the implications might be for exposure to zinc or something like that. But it's very vague about the risk of promoting these sort of the marketing of these sorts of foods. It doesn't. It's very unclear how this comes into its risk analysis. And this one, this example of risk sort of fits more with the socio-ecological paradigm. So here we see risk in terms of a threat to food systems. And it relates to an area, a colleague, I've been fortunate to work in the Pacific Islands from time to time, and a number of my colleagues there are really concerned about not just the globalisation of food supply, but the policies that are coming in with that globalisation and how it's disrupting the indigenous food systems. So Lois Engelberger put out this quite provocative piece, and again Barbara Burlingame. These names come back. These leading champions in the area. This lovely document that came out through FAO a couple of years ago, and Lois's chapter focuses what's happening in the Pacific with many of these nutrient interventions, these micronutrient interventions. She talks about the impact on not just the health of the community, but the social capital, the local economies in these communities, and the disruption that these often cause. And I think this is a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about this until Lois started emphasising. It's about the sustainability of these interventions as well. So let's say in a very positive way of analysing these, that they are improving health, they're not damaging the environment and so on. Well, what happens if circumstances change and the public providers of these interventions just up sticks and move? And suddenly we don't have these fortified foods available, or the GMs, or whatever it might be. In the interim, if we have disrupted the local food system, what sort of comeback is there? What resilience is left? So there's a vulnerability there as well. So the whole impact of this on indigenous food systems, I've seen no evidence has been taken into consideration in the policy making around people like Codex and so on. I just have to throw this one in. I have to just pose, how much is this whole nutrient agenda about sort of a lawyer's picnic and so on? What we're seeing in Australia, again, I keep apologising, the words are small here, but this is just an example where a legal fraternity are getting together and basically are hired guns to go to companies and what have you and say, we'll just find ways of working around the regulations, particularly, the health claims type regulations and so on. And the sort of organisational, it's really sophisticated. What we're seeing is this production line happening, certainly in Australia, where you've got certain nutrition scientists who are churning out systematic reviews of nutrient interventions, working with the lawyers and submitting these to the regulator. And so we're just seeing this sort of this churning through of health claims into the marketplace. It's a wonderful opportunity for these businesses, the lawyers, the scientists, to get together and start just driving these even more, these sort of micronutrient food labelling type interventions. So that was all the evidence push. Some examples of some policy pull. So how am I going for times? Just one example, Codex again. So in their work program that was recently announced, they have chosen to broaden the conceptual basis of the nutrient reference values. And they've broadened the concept from the traditional recommendations around deficiency problems to now encompassing the non-communicable disease agenda. In other words, what values can we set for single nutrients for preventing heart disease or what have you? I find that conceptually wrong. These diseases are multifactorial. And we're saying that individual nutrients can start solving these problems. And the ones that they've set up to commence this process are the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. If you go and do a quick Google search, here's what will come up when you look at omega-3s. The marketing of these, of products which are heavily fortified with these. So, it's a business, 25 billion euro around the omega-3 area. Documents talking about the opportunities for the industry in the omega-3. How much of this is about commerce versus public health? And Codex is feeding right into this. So it's both conceptually flawed and, again, this risk issue. Are they thinking through what they're setting up now? A pretty silly example that's arisen in Australia is, again, around this reductionist way of thinking, the nutrient profiling approach. So we have this. It started to be rolled out earlier this year on front of pack labelling, and in fact it goes to New Zealand as well. So it's bi-national social marketing and so on program. And they go under this very simplistic slogan, the more stars, the better. Now, that's their banner headline. They've got wonderful resources, very attractive website and all that. And progressively it's being rolled out. It's totally self-regulation. And it's one of those self-regulations examples which is being picked up like mad by the industry. And you start to think, gee, that's interesting. I wonder why that's happening. Industry love it. And what we're seeing is these contradictions coming through. So we're focusing here on nutrients, not foods. Here's the Australian Guide to Healthy. It's quite similar to the British plate, except we've separated out the junk food down here. So otherwise, sort of similar concepts. Here are two examples. And here are the stars. Confectionery gets 2.5 stars. Clearly from this group here. Here's a yoghurt, gets 1.5 stars. And it's in here. They've stripped away the food context. They're just focusing on the nutrients. You reduce everything down to the nutrients and you can play with algorithms and scoring to sort of make it do whatever you want. And you end up with these sort of contradictions. I just think we've got to be so careful with this reduction to everything down to nutrients. Because I love it, we have to do a conflict of interest one on this side of the equation as well. So this is... I've tried to condense 5 years of policy making into one slide here. But back in 2008, we commenced the review of the Dietary Guidelines for Australians. And we went in with high hopes. We had some wonderful people on the committee, people like Rosemary Stanton, you might know, Mandy Lee and so on. Sharon Friel, many of you would know. So really great public health nutrition people who are committed to healthy and sustainable diets. And we were pretty savvy right from the start when the terms of reference were being decided and so on. We got environmental sustainability onto the agenda. And we said, okay, last time when the guidelines were produced, sustainability was an appendix, tucked away at the end of the guidelines. It was good. It mentioned it, said some nice things. We want sustainability to be front and centre in these new guidelines. We'd like a guideline that is dedicated to sustainability and, ideally, would have sustainability as a theme that ran through every guideline. So if there was a guideline about meat consumption or a guideline about sugar consumption, it was about the sustainability implications and why and so on. That was sort of the gold standard model. And for the first 12 months, there was a bit of argy-bargy, but, the negotiation, that was looking good. By year 2, there was words that, yes, we might actually get both of those sort of ideals coming through. And then the resistance came, and then the kickback came. And the conflicts of interest and the capacity of those opposing that to gather their forces and start running the media campaigns was incredible. So the front page, I've never seen dietary guidelines on the front page of any newspaper, but it made it onto the front page of the Australian, the national newspaper, 2 years into the process. And so the Food and Grocery Council, I'm not sure what the equivalent is in whatever, the processed food industry lobby group. So they had made the statement, claimed that the NHMRC had lost the plot. What they've done is strayed into an area that they aren't expert in. I mean, we have people like Sharon Friel, international experts in the committee. A couple of days later, they editorialised this whole approach. I mean, this was like the highest profile nutrition I've had in the papers, well, since I'd ever been reading them. And the language, the provocative language. So social engineers want to force feed us dog method, and all this sort of these, the nanny state, the do-gooders, all those sort of terms were coming through. And then the paper, this one I've put up because this is the biggest selling paper in the country. And maybe this was dying down, so the lobbyists started to go through these people. And so here's a quote from them: "A doctor dishing out environmental advice, it's enough to make you sick." It was, and there's some more provocative stuff than even this, but they took a page to say it. But you can see, and so quickly the tide turned. And so by year 3 of this 5-year process, we'd suddenly peaked and we were coming down the other side of glory. And we suddenly saw that sustainability was, if we were lucky, might be one of the guidelines, which was a problem because sustainability shouldn't be shifted like this is one you can think of doing. It should be integrated into all of the guidelines. So it might have had its own little guideline, but okay, it was improvement from the previous version. 12 months later, there were threats to disband the whole guideline committee because the guideline committee didn't want to give in on this. And ultimately, in 2013, the guidelines were reduced, and guess what? The sustainability issue is an appendix in the latest guidelines. So it was a sort of an amazing drive up the hill and then a descent down the other side. Really interesting. And as Tim said, it's interesting watching what's happening in the US now. But there's lots of positives. I mean, if we see what's happened in Sweden, Qatar, the Brazilians have got I think, the gold standard of addressing sustainability. So there are lots of good examples around the world. And I think we should all be learning from these experiences in other countries about the sort of benchmarking what we can do for the future. So my hope is, an expectation for that matter is, that when these are next reviewed, and in theory it should be within 5 years of being launched, we'll have another opportunity then to, this time hopefully, be more successful and get them in. So overall impact, I think the research questions that we're asking are too often around nutrient interventions and not around food systems type questions. Excuse me. There's more investment in those micronutrient type interventions, so that's the opportunity to collect the evidence. And at the moment, the critical appraisal approaches are geared towards those nutrient type interventions, not the food systems and so on interventions. And so I refer to this virtual cycle that's become self-perpetuating. So we're skewing the evidence base, I believe. And, not surprisingly, we're constantly seeing the interventions that now policymakers are approving around those micronutrient type interventions and very few around the food systems type interventions. So let me finish on just a few slides about what we might do going forward. Research questions. The priority has to be that we start trying to level the playing field and start prioritising research questions. So we start putting onto the agenda of the Cochranes of the world and other funding agencies that we do systematic reviews around food systems work, around diet. There is some dietary pattern type work, and the Mediterranean diets and so on. That's great, but there are more dietary patterns than just Mediterranean dietary patterns. So more systematic reviews there will help us build our ammunition for those sort of policies into the future. The evidence synthesis model. We need to change the protocols. We need to stop saying that we have to conform with the randomised control trials as the gold standard for everything, no matter what the intervention is. And so, I'm suggesting, this is sort of this work in progress type idea, that if we align it to the paradigm, if we start thinking how is it being framed, that then leads us to think about, well, what is the nature of the mechanistic relationship? Therefore, what sort of method matches that? And how do we apply that when we're collecting our evidence? And that would also inform what's the scope of the risk we should be looking at? So this is sort of thinking this through about how we start to offer solutions for reforming evidence collection. And ideally what we should be doing with our reviews is not just looking at efficacy and some sort of risk, but we should be looking at incorporating the implications for equity and for the policy application itself. So often these systematic reviews get done and there's no statement about, well, what does this mean for policy? So a paper that's just come out in the last month did a systematic review of systematic reviews of obesity prevention. And only a third of those systematic reviews discuss the policy implications of their findings. So, you know, let's get active and start saying food systems type evidence is relevant and why, how we can engage. And the third reform I think we can start working around is the governance arrangements around this collecting and synthesising of evidence. So what are the rules for how we manage and avoid conflicts of interest? Now, many of us have spoken with people like Cochrane and so on. Cochrane do some really good work. I mean, they certainly recognise this as an issue and they certainly make efforts to try and manage this conflict of interest. But often their comment is, well, it's really difficult to identify what we mean by conflict of interest, particularly when it might not be a junk food sponsor. It might be the front agency for the junk food sponsor. So how do you identify, you know, what is a conflict versus what's a genuine and a credible philanthropist? Tim's heard me talk about this today a few times. I'm really excited about this sort of network analysis approach. It's getting more and more sophisticated. And I think if we start, there's software programs now coming up. So this, you might have seen this from the BMJ earlier this year, where they did this very nice analysis of the funders of government people and researchers from sugar sources. And you can see some lovely patterns coming out when you do this sort of analysis. You see who's connected with who, how close they are together, how many people will feed through. So they talk about these being nodes towards the decision-making process, and you can look at how, and these might be individuals or an agency, and you can see how they connect together, how close they are to the minister. Lots of interesting things. You can how thick you make these lines might be how powerful it is. You can do lots of play around with this sort of analysis. To me, that's a really nice tool for starting to help people think about where the conflicts of interest are and how different people are working with others, and sort of shining a light on what otherwise might be quite hidden. We're struggling at the moment, aren't we, to get support for a lot of food systems interventions and so on. So obviously you can't reform without talking about how we can collaborate with others and build capacity. The whole agenda around public-private partnerships is an interesting one. And this tension between involving these partnerships in policy making versus policy implementation. I mean, I see no problem particularly with bringing in PPPs for implementing policy, but I do see a lot of question marks over bringing them in to the table to make the policy. So those sort of relationships. So this is the final one, just on some methods. I won't go through all these in the interest of time. I think there are a lot of interesting issues we need to keep reminding ourselves that food and dietary patterns aren't drugs, so our methods need to be more sophisticated to pick up those differences. Just the last one, I think when we're talking about systems models, again, very excited about some of the work that's coming out. I mean, systems has been around for decades, but increasingly we're becoming more sophisticated about how we develop our program logic models. So how we map out the system and we look at the relationships there. I think we need to start thinking more about these interdisciplinary relationships and bringing in people from agriculture or the economists and so on when we start to unravel our food systems and work them through. And one example we've got happening, a team I'm working with, is around scenario modelling. Again, scenario modeling's been around for decades, but we're applying it in a sustainability context. So we're looking, scenarios is all about what if this happens? Where are we going to end up? So it's challenging that sort of, the classic conventional evidence-based approach. It's saying, we're just going to say, if we change this, what would happen? We haven't got the luxury of waiting for another 20 years to keep collecting our evidence. Let's just start building these scenarios. And when we get there, we'll find under these scenarios which we call them storylines, which storyline is the most sustainable, healthy and so on. Let's then go back from that to make our policy. It's called backcasting. So we model into the future and then we backcast. What policies do we set in place to get to that scenario ahead of scenario B, which might be the doomsday scenario? And this is the sort of stuff I think we need to be creative, we need to be innovative in how we start doing these sort of methods into the future to be building our evidence stock. So my final comments. I've been sort of quite critical of nutrition science, but we have got a strong history as a discipline in producing evidence, particularly around the nutrient deficiency approaches. And that's great, and that persists today. But it's not sufficient for the NCD's sustainability agendas. So we need to reform so we can ethically, effectively, equitably take on those challenges. And I'll focus particularly on reforming the concepts, the methods and the governance arrangements to move forward into the future. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Geraldine Gilbert. I'm in the food team at a sustainable development charity called Forum for the Future. Actually, we do lots of scenarios and backcasting from a sustainability perspective.
Brilliant.
We're very interested in how to bring together the nutritional and the agriculture side and bring all of that together. I'm just wondering whether you think emerging microbiome science holds promise for sort of telling us new things and better things for what we should be eating and how, and whether that, it feels like there's something there, but what, how excited should we be about that?
So I'm not familiar with microbiome. Is this like the algal stuff and the working around algae?
It's all the trillions of other beings in our gut and on our skin and so on. And there are, so we're links coming out between that, what's going on in our gut, and obesity, diabetes, various autoimmune issues, depression, personality, all sorts. We don't know quite what those links are yet, but so I'm just wondering if that might revolutionise nutrition science or not.
Yes, yes. I mean, I've heard this comment that, in fact, we've got the host-parasite relationship wrong. The microbes are the host, and we're the parasite. Is that the way it works? So look, obviously from my answer, I'm not familiar with that area, but it seems to me, just on first blush, that it's probably more sort of that medical paradigm type way of thinking, isn't it? I mean, it's very reductionist. I mean, if we've got those particular factors that are control, what would be controlling them? The nutrients that we're consuming?
Well, and it's an ecological analysis of stomach flora and fauna, and saying, instead of looking for a single fix in it, this is my understanding of it, the companies, that's why she's asking, the companies investing in it say, how can they do this? I mean, functional foods has gone that way. No?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm interested because it might change how we understand ourselves. So rather than being at the top of the hierarchy of the guardians of the animal kingdom and so on, we're more like a walking sack of microbes. So we're an ecosystem. So that could shift. If that can shift our understanding of what we need to be healthy, then I think that's got some promise by.
I mean, I suspect you've got far better answers than I have for this, but it does sound interesting if it's a systems way of thinking at a micro level. That's really interesting. Yeah. So it's a very.
It's not single nutrient. It's sort of slightly more complex. 1, 2, 3.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Helen Crawley. I run a small public health nutrition charity here in the UK, and I used to teach food nutrition policy here at City. I've got a bit of a Codex question, actually, because I sit on Codex.
Okay.
The Codex, there's lots of committees, but I go to the nutrition and foods for special dietary use.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay, so the Codex committees sit under the UN as the standard-setting committees, and there's a whole series of them, but there's one that goes under the name of CCNF-SDU, which is Nutrition and Foods for Special Dietary Uses, and I go specifically because I work in the world of infant formula. One of the things I was going to ask, I don't know if you know this, is whether the academics in Australia have ever tried to have any influence on their Codex member state committee. When you go to Codex, there's about 450 people in the room, member states committees, which are made up of civil servants and industry NGOs, and observer NGOs from, who are not industry, and there's about 6 of us who don't represent a commercial interest out of 450 people. But within the Australian delegation, which is run by a lovely civil servant called Janine, what would be brilliant would be if academics would get involved within that committee, because all the evidence, all the fantastic evidence, is totally irrelevant to Codex. It's about business interests.
So yeah, I should have explained Codex too, because Codex is one of those agencies that has so much influence, and I think it tends to fly under the radar in food policy circles. You know, we're busy talking about social marketing issues, all those often, and beavering away on the side. It's not that they're a small organisation; they're huge. They're making these decisions about what goes in our food, how our food's labelled, trade issues, and so as Helen's saying, Codex was set up in 1963, and its original modus operandi was about trade, and then public health did get onto the agenda. And unlike national food regulators, where there's a clear descending list of objectives with protecting public health at the top, at Codex, the commercial agenda and the public health agenda have equal footing, and that's an interesting sort of play. Works. So yes, I know Janine, and she's a good nutritionist. So if your question is about how, we should be working with it. The way Codex works is really interesting because exactly as you said, it's partly secretive, but on the other hand, they sort of would be quick to claim that all of the issues they're discussing in their agenda items get circulated and so on. And it's that issue, the disconnect between the practice and what they say. You've got to have capacity and resources to engage with it. You've got to know what's happening. And these big companies and so on, they are employing their team of lawyers or whatever to know when these things are coming out. And there's usually just a very small window of time to be engaged with the consultation.
We pay ourselves to do it.
You pay yourself.
For those who don't know, Codex Element, it's Codex Element. They're using the shorthand that we all use. Codex stands for Codex Alimentarius Commission. It's jointly secretariat by the WHO and FAO. Mark did a bit of his PhD on it. And it's technically the intergovernmental sort of melting pot where food standards are being set. So while you think you've got a national or even a local set of criteria, it's being set up here. And as Helen rightly said, and Mark, and I think several of us know, it's stacked with industry friendly. As government committees. We did a study 23 years ago,
I remember, actually,
which you quoted in your PhD, which is, well, of course, nothing to do with why it passed. And where we showed, I think it was about 2,700 members of Codex across a year. It was a vast majority were industry funded. So the point Helen is making is
the
point is, after the criticisms, it's gone back to business as usual, literally.
Can I just make a couple of follow-up comments? Helen, you've opened up a whole lot of issues around that, but Codex also, again, saying, I think as food policy people, we need to focus more on Codex. It's assuming more and more importance. It always has been important, but now it becomes, effectively the arbiter of a lot of global trade agreements around the health issue. Yeah, they refer to Codex when there might be a dispute around a safety concern. Or a nutrition concern. So they will go to Codex and they'll say, well, what is Codex's position on GM or a food labelling issue? Particularly what we're finding in the Pacific is if we want to try and run a program around a labelling issue for a high-fat diet or something like that, an importing country or exporting company will be able to go to the World Trade Organization to dispute it. They will then go on to Codex to give a ruling on the evidence and so on around that. Can I just make two other quick comments on it? The infant formula one is really interesting. I had a chance to go to Codex on the Australian delegation a couple of times. And the very first Codex meeting I went to, and we're talking back in the 90s, it's early 90s in fact, and it was the Codex Nutrition Committee. I was just young, naive, and sort of really enthusiastic with what's all going to happen here. And the very first, the night before the meeting started and I'd arrived, I won't say who it was because I don't want to get into trouble, but this person from a UN agency came up to me and a person from Canada and took us out for a coffee and told us how it was going to play out with the infant formula discussion. And told us, in fact, the EU had strong representation from the Swiss delegate. The Swiss delegate had strong representation from, I'll let you work out who was representing the Swiss. and this is what was going to be said. And it was all at the time around the age of exclusive breast milk consumption. I've expressed that badly, but whether it was going to be 4 months, 6 months, and the wording became really significant around that. And sure enough, that's what came up. And the debate, he flagged in advance how it was going to go, which delegations were going to say which, and so on. And what he did, and this is just a fascinating, here I am so impressionable and thinking, wow, this is how it happens. He went round and then spoke to several representatives from the powerful low and middle income countries. So we're talking about India, Indonesia, these big countries. And he asked, and the reason he talked to us was he asked us to talk to those countries that happened geographically to be near us. I don't know why geography would matter, but it did. So he sort of had this, he spread out his tentacles through various people, and he was very, and what happened was, of course, then he retreated. And it was the Indonesian and particularly the Indian delegates who got up and basically said, we don't want this in our country, these are the problems. They'd been forewarned. And it was just the most amazing example of, lobbying as the issue was unfolding. And it was just quite rewarding to see that happen. So I guess I'm sort of in a long way getting back to your point that I think it can happen if you can influence the delegates on Codex, yeah.
We've got a queue, so we're going to be quicker. Just to say that the study that we did 25 years ago, it needs to be replicated. It would be a great thing for someone to do. I can give you that it was a lot of work. I raised the money for it, so it was a lot of work, but it needs to be done by someone.
Thank you. My name's Anne Murcott. I'm at SOAS, University of London. I've got.
Can you hear?
Closer to the mic, please. Yeah, sure. Is that better?
No, the mic is not broadcasting. It's telling.
Yeah, sure. Is that better? I can shout. My name's Anne Murcott. I'm at SOAS, University of London. I've got a brief comment and a brief question, which I think will have a very long answer.
I'll try
to. The brief comment is you were inviting contributions to thinking about how you might proceed, and you talked about the modelling and backcasting. And I wondered if you'd also thought, given obviously that you can't do RCTs in the nature of things, and indeed whether you would even want to, but to use what you might call natural experiments, so that, for instance, to see what happened in the single year that the Danes introduced the fat tax. And there is some, actually, it comes from the humanities and social sciences. They're working on it. And I can put you in touch with them if you're at all interested. I think those are collaborations which, if you want to develop collaboration, look to the social scientists far more, because we've been talking about an awful lot of this for donkey's years, including indeed doing the network analysis. I did some of that 40 years ago, not in this field. So in other words, there are collaborations which look as though they could be very useful. Yeah. The question comes back to your experience on the provision of dietary guidelines. And I wondered if you knew what the source was of getting sustainability back into an appendix only. Where was it coming from, this pressure? Who was involved? What were the interests? In other words, what were the politics of it? That's the question.
Very quickly.
Food and Grocery Council, as a fun organisation for all these others, and the meat industry. If I had to single out two, the meat and livestock people. So they were the most vociferous. There were lots, but if I had to pick two, I'd put those at the front of the queue.
If you want, the frontier is Kelly Parsons, who's doing a research here from the Centre for Food Policy with the Australian government, comparing and contrasting UK and Australian policy formation, and I think that would be our view. Do you want to?
That would be what, sorry?
The view?
Yes.
No, I don't have anything to add, really.
The answer is yes.
The Food and Grocery Council are very powerful.
And it was them. Sorry, we've got a queue of about 5 people.
So Tara Garnett, Food Climate Research Network, University of Oxford. I sort of want to make a plea in defence of reductionism. So the Brazilian Dietary Guidelines, which are quite radical and quite new, and they look fantastic, and ecologically they look fantastic, but are they? I don't know what the evidence base upon which they assume that they're dietary model is inherently better for the environment as well as for health. And I think there needs to be a lot more research there that foods that are less processed actually have a lower environmental impact. I mean, you can look at it very simplistically in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and you can question that, but in terms of other environmental indicators, I think a little bit more thought needs to go into that. And so I think aesthetics and ideology frame everybody's use and selection of evidence, and not just big business or whatever it might be. And linked to that is the point about the medical approach as opposed to the lifestyles approach as opposed to an ecological approach. And I take the example of meat, which from an environmental perspective, on the whole, is very, very problematic. But from a nutrition perspective, my understanding is that it's associated with lots of bad ways of eating, but the food industry argue that if you change the context of consumption, so compare a burger with a Sunday dinner with loads of vegetables in it or whatever it might be, it's associated with positive health outcomes, and then you're mixing up your red meats and your white meats and all the rest of it. So you could forgive the food industry for saying, actually, let's go back down to our really, really narrow medical approach to really tease out what the nutrients are, what the micronutrients are, etc., etc., etc. And also, if you look at it from a sort of other worldview perspective, where you say that meat is bad for the environment, meat is generally not a good idea, vegetarian and vegan diets are better, but oh dear, we haven't got vitamin B12 and we might be a bit deficient in one or two other nutrients. Let's fortify our food and solve that problem. Same with the no fish in the sea answer. Well, we can look at fortifying canola, etc., with our omega-3s. I'm not justifying anything particularly. I'm just saying that everybody comes riddled with their ideologies, and when we're looking at moving towards paradigms, I think it's really important within the environmental, civil society community to be very self-critical about one's own assumptions and ideologies.
So I'm not disputing that ideology is critical, and I think the interplay between ideology and evidence it explains how the evidence is used. So I totally agree there. I'm not sure I agree with all your details though. I don't think I certainly wasn't intending to argue that it's black and white about meat. So I'm not saying meat bad, never have it. So I think it is more nuanced than that.
There's a lot of polarisation.
Yeah, well, and I think that's I think that is a problem. And I don't think we should be using that as a basis for, say, we do a reductionist approach, we use a holistic approach. I mean, I think we do have to be more nuanced in how we deal with it. So while you're talking, so many things, but when you started, you talked about the Brazilian ones, and the issue that I interpreted the Brazilian issue is it's not just about sustainability. I mean, they talked about culture. They talked about a whole lot of other factors. So yes, you might pull it apart for meat and sustainability because maybe meat, if you have twice as much, is better for the environment. But what does it mean about the cultural factors and the other dimensions?
Logically, you take a bunch of London teenagers, they don't care about local culture. That changes too.
Again, I'm not disputing it, but I think to sort of frame your argument and saying that it's the sustainability issue is doing a disservice, because the Brazilians talked about well, it's a systems type thing. They're talking about how that feeds into the economic basis, how that feeds. And I think we need to think, the ideology might shape the sustainability one. Does it shape everything else? In the end, you sort of grind yourself into not doing anything. And I guess that's the follow-up comment I'd have. It is about, I really get concerned when people say you don't have evidence to do anything. And it's like, well, who are you? What are you saying? How much evidence is enough? What type of it? It gets back to sort of where I'm starting from. And I sort of think we're getting to the stage now where, of course, we've got to be evidence-informed, but, geez, I'm concerned that we're going to have it all tied in a neat bow before we act. And I think we need to start taking some risks. I think we need to start, trying some things, be brave, but monitor it, and if it's not working, stop it. I'm just a bit concerned we might end up shooting ourselves in the foot.
I'm with you. I just that point about self-reflection, I think, is always important.
What is your discipline?
Jack of all trades.
Okay.
Say who you are.
Tony Allen from King's College and SOAS. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to be, because I'm being told to be short, I'm going to be a bit hard, perhaps. Please avoid words like governance. Use politics. Because what you described in your anecdote about the Codex was all politics, commercial politics. So every lecture you start with, or the first lecture you ever give, should be that story, to get the people who are doing reduction of science to realize that this is where the information is going. It's going into a political domain. Mm-hmm. I, like you, spent 20, 25 years discovering that, in my case, my hydrology was interesting, could be quantified, but it didn't explain anything regarding outcomes of how water is my interest, water is managed. Very little. Obviously, it's told you something about it in the long run, but in the long run, as Kane said, we're all dead. In the meantime, we've got into an awful lot of other problems. We need to start with the politics, because what I found was that in all cases, the outcome is explained by politics, as you found in your Codex meeting. So can we, I heard a message over here saying that some social scientists have been saying this for some time. It is where we need to start, and certainly that's how I start my introduction. So, you see, scientists are like industry and like everyone else. There's a path dependence. We've had, when I started in science, there were fewer scientists, but there are now many more. We publish like mad for each other. And we get rewarded, and certainly we're trying to move away from it in the UK, but we still get rewarded for the quality and volume of what we write for each other. We're not given any kick to do the right thing. There's a path dependence in what we do. We want to get out of the reduction of science. We need to do some, but if we're going to do something really useful, and younger people, the reason I'm speaking like this so trenchantly is a lot of young people here, please insist that your people that you respect and are lecturing to you start with the politics.
This is, I won't allow you to comment on that. It's a classic and wonderful Tony Allen statement. My colleague Martin Carroll always puts it as, instead of saying evidence-based policy, we should be asking, I nearly said this earlier, what's the evidence that policymakers need? What are the problems that you want to get to? Is this what you wanted to
just a comment. Sorry.
I thought that's what you were getting.
Monique Gratz from the University of Surrey. I think it's what is the evidence that policymakers use, and we don't have a lot of transparency of the policy process, which is, I think, another interesting point to try and get insights into how and what evidence is used, what evidence is commissioned, and the processes by which that happens. And I think then it becomes this very circular process where it's also between what's being funded, what's being done, and those are the processes, I think, again, that will explain a lot of what goes on. And maybe also to highlight the collation of evidence processes. So we have some formalized processes that happen in scientific advisory committees, but some of it happens in just the doing of reviews. And again, I think thinking much more systematically about, in a systems-based way about those processes, I think will also give us a better understanding how to potentially influence and change the way that we work.
But you don't disagree with systems thinking, looking for evidence within systems context, do you?
No. On the contrary, yeah. But I think we have to sort of think of, the system being also inclusive of that political process at many levels.
Yeah.
There's a question over here. This is a very deep discussion. Excellent.
Thank you. I'm Anna Taylor from the Food Foundation. Thanks very much for your talk. I found it really interesting. I just wonder if can you hear me now? I wonder if there's another argument, really, that you could make to research funders, particularly around the socio-ecological paradigm, and that's really around the extent of evident impact that you can actually show through looking at research, through doing research in that way. So I'm thinking about the Brazil case is a really good case in point, where we've seen kind of rapid reductions in undernutrition over a relatively short time period, and a speed of reduction which, even if you add up all the sort of Lancet nutrition-specific interventions, you'd never get that, and do them at scale and reach 90% of the population, you'd never get that speed of reduction which you get when you've got, very integrated public policy, mass poverty reduction, et cetera, all happening at once. So I think a strong argument in favour of that kind of approach is that systems look is is that you could pick up much bigger effects potentially, and which are arguably more valuable for public policy than, you know, a very marginal impact achieved through a particular biomedical approach.
Completely agree. And I, in a way, it was very simplistic what I was saying. I think what we're talking about with these programs is usually multifaceted, so I didn't want to say it's either or. You know, I think particularly in these low and middle income countries, if there's huge amounts of stunting and the prevalence of micronutrient malnutrition is high, you don't sit around and wait for food systems to be developed and you know, you get in there with your micronutrient interventions and you transition between the different interventions. So I didn't mean to say it's just one, you put all your eggs in one basket. It's multifaceted how we do this.
Very good. Okay, we've got 2 questions to do in about 4 minutes.
Okay, this is very quick. It's actually not a question. My name's Suzanne Jaspers, Bristol University. I was kind of sitting here struggling to think about the range of interventions that nutrition interventions that you might have within the socio-ecological model, and how to develop an evidence base for that. And what I'm thinking is maybe another kind of thing to add to your list of things to do would be to also look at some of the kind of negative social and political effects of the kind of nutrient-based medical approaches. So it's just, you know, another kind of approach to kind of advocate for a more socio-ecological approach.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, quick response would be, I think we've got an opportunity with these sort of natural experiments type approach. So we could go and look at comparisons between two countries or 2 areas and look at the different food systems that might be in play there, and why do some food systems have a higher integrity than another system? What are the variables at play there? So those sort of natural experiments, I think we could take advantage of more.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Pauling from Alexandra Rose Charity. We work on food poverty and healthy eating projects in London, and we're very interested in evidence-based, and it's really difficult for us to gather evidence-based, and sometimes I think it's about telling a story as much as it is about gathering evidence from a charity's perspective. But that aside, I wonder if there's a real opportunity when it comes, you know, you talk about the national and the supranational level, how difficult it is to influence policy. I wonder if there's an opportunity with cities-based policy, because there's a lot of work that's been done with cities around climate change, and so you've got the C40s approach with all the big cities around the world working on climate change issues. A group within that are now working on food policy issues, linking it to climate change, but it's possibly an area where we can push the agenda more easily than we can at a national level. And you know, I think there's stuff coming out in the next few weeks in Milan with a cities protocol based around their expo. So there might be an opportunity with cities rather than national governments to make progress on these issues.
I think that's a really good suggestion, and Martin Carraher was sort of explaining to me some of the opportunities around the UK, and Manchester seems to be doing a lot of work with their infrastructure around the health providers and so on. I mean, maybe there's an opportunity there. So I think it's a great idea. It just becomes too big, I think, when you go nationally, so I think we do have to shrink it down. And I think Tim was talking to me before about maybe even island states. You could start going to the Pacific and looking at some things. So I think, yeah, it's more manageable, isn't it? So it's a good idea. Yeah.